In 1854, a book appeared in Detroit that shouldn't have existed. Its author was a man who had been stripped of everything, chained in the belly of a slave ship, and forced to labor under the Brazilian sun. Yet somehow, impossibly, he sat in an integrated college classroom in New York, fluent in 6 languages, writing the only first-hand account of Brazilian slavery that would ever reach the world. His name was Mahoma Gardo Bakwakwa, and his journey from the trading towns of West Africa to the abolitionist lecture halls of North America defied every barrier that the 19th century could construct. But here's the question that haunted everyone who heard his story, and it should haunt you too. How does someone who loses absolutely everything, their freedom, their name, their very identity, not only survive but transform into one of the most educated voices against slavery in the entire Western Hemisphere? Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about the power of knowledge and the possibility of transformation. Let me take you back to the 1820s, to a place most Americans had never heard of and couldn't imagine. Jugu, a bustling trading town in the kingdom of Bergu in what we now call Benin. This wasn't the Africa of stereotypes or simplistic narratives. This was a sophisticated commercial center where caravans arrived from distant kingdoms, where multiple languages mixed in the marketplace, where Islamic scholars debated theology and merchants calculated complex trades. Mahoma was born around 1824 into a world of privilege and learning. His family weren't just wealthy, they were cosmopolitan. Muslim merchants with connections stretching across West Africa. Think about what that meant. While American plantation owners were passing laws to keep enslaved people illiterate, young Mahoma was sitting in Quranic school, learning to read and write in Arabic. He was mastering ajami, the art of writing African languages in Arabic script. He was being trained as a merchant, learning the skills of negotiation, calculation, and cross-cultural communication. His father's house was a place of books and learning. Imagine the scene. Mahoma, as a young boy, sitting cross-legged on woven mats, reciting verses from the Quran, his voice joining with other students in the rhythmic cadence of memorization. His teachers were respected scholars, men who had themselves traveled to distant cities, who could discuss theology and law, who understood the wider Islamic world that stretched from West Africa to the Middle East. The education Mahoma received wasn't just religious. It was practical, commercial, and deeply intellectual. He learned mathematics for trade calculations. He studied the art of negotiation, watching his father conduct business with merchants from different ethnic groups and kingdoms. He absorbed the protocols of diplomacy and commerce that made Jugu a thriving hub. This was a complete education, one that prepared him for leadership in his community. Jugu itself was remarkable. The town sat at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting the Sahel to the forest kingdoms of the south. Gold, kola nuts, cloth, and salt moved through its markets. Traders speaking Hausa, Dendi, Fulani, and other languages negotiated deals in the shade of compound walls. The town had a mixed population of Muslims and practitioners of traditional African religions, and they coexisted with a level of tolerance that would have surprised many Europeans of that era. Mahoma's family participated fully in this cosmopolitan world. They weren't isolated or provincial. They understood international commerce. They maintained relationships with trading partners across vast distances. They navigated complex political relationships between different kingdoms and ethnic groups. This was the world that shaped young Mahoma, a world of literacy, commerce, diplomacy, and intellectual engagement. Mahoma completed the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, becoming a marabout, an Islamic religious teacher. Think about what that journey meant. In the 1840s, traveling from West Africa to Mecca wasn't a simple plane flight. It was months of overland travel through diverse territories, across the Sahara, through Egypt, into Arabia. It required resources, determination, and the support of a network of fellow Muslims along the route. The Hajj journey from West Africa was an epic undertaking. Pilgrims would join caravans that traveled for months across the Sahara Desert, stopping at oases and trading posts along the way. They'd face sandstorms, water shortages, bandits, and the constant challenge of navigating through territories controlled by different rulers. Many who attempted the journey never returned. The fact that Muhammad's family could afford this pilgrimage and that he completed it as a young man speaks volumes about their status and his dedication. When he returned from Mecca, Muhammad carried the title of Marabout with pride. This wasn't just a religious designation. In West African Muslim communities, marabouts were respected as teachers, advisors, and spiritual guides. They were literate in Arabic, knowledgeable about Islamic law and theology, and often served as mediators in disputes. Muhammad's future seemed secure. He had education, religious authority, family connections, and the respect of his community. By his late teens, he was working as a bodyguard for a local ruler, a position of trust and responsibility. He spoke Dendi, probably Hausa, and Arabic fluently. He was literate, educated, and free. He had a future mapped out before him, a life of respect and influence in his community. He might have become a merchant like his father, or a religious teacher, or a political advisor. The possibilities were wide open. Remember that word, free. Because in 1845, when Muhammad was about 20 years old, everything changed in a single moment. The exact circumstances remain disputed, and maybe that's fitting. Trauma has a way of fracturing memory, creating multiple versions of the same unbearable truth. One account says he participated in a raid on a nearby village, got drunk on palm wine afterward, fell asleep and woke up in chains, betrayed and kidnapped by the very people he'd fought alongside. Another version speaks of a double kidnapping, captured as a child, ransomed, then seized again as an adult. What we know for certain is this: around 1845, Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa, educated son of a prosperous merchant family, became property. The transition was brutal and immediate. One moment, he was a free man with agency and identity. The next, he was merchandise, his value reduced to his physical strength and health. They marched him south, 300 miles on foot, from the interior kingdoms to the coastal slave markets. Every step took him further from everything he knew. Every language he heard became less familiar, every face more foreign. The man who had studied sacred texts was now being studied himself, examined like livestock, his teeth checked, his muscles prodded. Imagine what that journey was like. Muhammad, chained to other captives, walking for weeks through territories he'd never seen. The physical pain of the shackles cutting into his ankles and wrists, the humiliation of being displayed and inspected at each stop. The growing realization that he was being taken to the coast, to the slave ships he'd heard about but never imagined would claim him. The desperate hope that somehow his family would discover what happened and ransom him back. The slow death of that hope with each mile traveled. The coastal slave markets were nightmares of efficiency. European and African traders had perfected a system of human commodification that reduced people to units of labor. Muhammad would have been held in barracoons, fortified enclosures near the coast where captives waited for ships. He would have seen the ocean for the first time, that vast expanse of water that represented the final severing from everything he'd known. He would have heard stories from other captives about what awaited across that water, stories that couldn't capture the full horror of what was coming. And then came the ship. You need to understand something about 1845. By this point, the transatlantic slave trade was illegal. Portugal, which controlled Brazil, had accepted the international ban. Britain was patrolling the Atlantic with warships, trying to intercept slave ships. But money has a way of making people ignore laws, and Brazil's sugar and coffee plantations were hungry for labor, so the trade continued, hidden, rushed, even more brutal than before, because now it had to be done in secret. The illegal nature of the trade in 1845 made the Middle Passage even worse than it had been decades earlier. Ships were designed to be fast, to outrun British patrols. They were packed even more densely with human cargo because every voyage carried the risk of interception and total loss. The crews were desperate and violent, knowing they were breaking international law and could face severe punishment if caught. There was no pretense of humanity, no concern for the survival rate of the captives beyond the minimum needed to make the voyage profitable. Mahoma was forced into the hold of a slave ship bound for Brazil. In his own words later, he would describe the loathsomeness of that crossing. "Let me paint you the picture," he painted, "because this matters. Hundreds of people crammed into a space designed for cargo, not humans. The air so thick and foul you could barely breathe. The ship rolling in the Atlantic swells, people vomiting, defecating, dying in the darkness. The smell of death mixing with the smell of fear. They stripped everyone naked. The slavers claimed it was for health and sanitation, to expose any diseases or conditions. But it was also about breaking you down, destroying dignity, reducing human beings to bodies that could be bought and sold. Every day, the same rations. Boiled corn and a pint of water, that's it, for weeks. The Middle Passage typically took 6 to 8 weeks from West Africa to Brazil, depending on winds and currents, 6 to 8 weeks in conditions that defy description. Mahoma lay in that hold, unable to stand, barely able to move, surrounded by hundreds of other captives in the same condition. The heat was suffocating. The darkness was broken only by occasional shafts of light when the crew opened hatches to throw down food or remove bodies. The sounds were a constant assault, moaning, crying, praying in dozens of languages, the creaking of the ship, the shouts of the crew above. Mahoma watched people die in that hold. He felt his own body weakening, his spirit being tested in ways his Quranic education had never prepared him for. When British patrol ships came near, the crew would move the enslaved people to different parts of the ship, hiding them, evading the very laws that were supposed to prevent this horror. The fear during those moments was intense. If the British caught the ship, what would happen? Would they be freed, or would the crew throw them overboard to destroy the evidence? There were moments during that crossing when Mahoma must have wondered if death would be preferable to this living nightmare. Many captives chose death, refusing food, throwing themselves overboard when brought on deck for exercise, finding any way to escape the horror. But Mahoma survived. Something in him, some core of resilience or stubborn refusal to let them win, kept him alive through those weeks of hell. And then, after weeks that must have felt like years, they arrived in Pernambuco, in Recife, Brazil. Now here's where Mahoma's story becomes even more remarkable, because he didn't just survive what came next. He observed it. He remembered it. He would later document it in ways that no one else ever did. According to research published by the Royal Historical Society, his autobiography would become the only known first-hand account of slavery in Brazil written by someone who lived it. Think about that, the only voice. Brazil was the largest destination for enslaved Africans in the entire transatlantic trade. More enslaved people were brought to Brazil than to the United States, the Caribbean, and all other destinations combined. Nearly 5 million people over 3 centuries. Yet we have almost no first-hand accounts from the enslaved themselves about what that experience was like. The Portuguese and Brazilian authorities kept meticulous records of ships, cargoes, and sales, but the voices of the people who suffered through it, almost completely silent. Until Mahoma. A baker bought him first. Mahoma found himself in a city where Portuguese was the language of power, where he had to learn new words for his new reality. And here's something extraordinary. While enslaved, while working under the constant threat of the lash, while his legal status was questionable at best because he'd been trafficked illegally, Mahoma taught himself Portuguese. Let that sink in. A man stripped of freedom, forced to labor, found time and willpower to master the language of his oppressors, not just to survive, but to understand. To prepare for something he couldn't yet name but somehow knew was coming. How did he do it? We can imagine the process. Listening carefully to conversations around him, asking questions when it was safe, perhaps finding a fellow enslaved person who spoke both a language he knew and Portuguese, practicing words in his mind during the long hours of labor, using his existing literacy in Arabic to understand the structure of language itself, applying those skills to this new tongue. It was an act of incredible determination and intelligence. Learning a new language while enslaved was an act of resistance in itself. The slave system depended on keeping people ignorant, isolated, unable to communicate effectively or understand the mechanisms of their oppression. By mastering Portuguese, Muhammad was claiming back a piece of his agency. He was gathering information, understanding the world around him, preparing himself for an opportunity he couldn't yet see but believed would come. He passed through several owners over the next 2 years. Each transaction, each sale, was another reminder that he wasn't considered human in this system, just property that could be transferred like furniture. He witnessed things he would later testify about. The way enslaved people were kept ignorant of their fate until the last moment. As he wrote in testimony published in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, these slaves never knew they were to be sent away until they were placed on board the ship. He saw the slave markets, the farmers with their many enslaved workers, the lash being used pretty freely, as he put it with grim understatement. He worked, he watched, he learned, and he waited. He was gathering information, storing memories, preparing himself even though he didn't know for what. Brazilian slavery had its own particular characteristics that differed from slavery in the United States. The plantation system was brutal, focused primarily on sugar and coffee production. Enslaved people were literally worked to death, with plantation owners calculating that it was more profitable to work people until they died and buy replacements than to maintain them long term. The mortality rate was staggering. Urban slavery, where Muhammad spent much of his time, was somewhat different but no less dehumanizing. Enslaved people worked as domestic servants, artisans, street vendors, and laborers, often with slightly more autonomy than plantation workers, but still subject to violence and the constant threat of being sold. By 1847, Muhammad had come under the ownership of a man named Clemente José da Costa, a ship captain. They gave him a new name, as slavers always did, José da Costa. Another way of erasing who you were, making you into an extension of your owner. He was assigned to work as a cabin steward on a trading vessel called the Lembrança. The ship made runs down to southern Brazil and back to Rio de Janeiro, carrying coffee, that bitter crop that fueled so much suffering. And it was on this ship, serving coffee to free men while he remained enslaved, that Muhammad heard something that would change everything. New York. The sailors talked about it, a city in the north, a place where slavery had recently been abolished, where black people walked free. The words must have sounded like a fairy tale, like something too good to be true. But Muhammad listened. He filed the information away. He learned that the Lembrança would be sailing to New York to deliver a coffee consignment. And he made a decision. June 1847. The Lembrança docked in New York Harbor. Muhammad could see the city from the ship. Buildings, docks, people moving freely. Somewhere out there was freedom, if he could just reach it. He knew the risk. If he failed, the punishment would be severe. Captain da Costa would make an example of him, but he also knew something else. This might be his only chance. So he jumped. Imagine that moment. The decision crystallizing in an instant, the leap from the ship into the water, the swim to shore, every stroke taking him closer to a freedom he'd been denied for 2 years, closer to reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him in Africa. The water cold, the distance uncertain, the fear of being caught mixing with the desperate hope of making it to land. He made it to shore and immediately sought help. This is where the story becomes a testament to the power of networks, of people who believed that slavery was wrong and were willing to act on that belief. The New York Committee of Vigilance, an abolitionist organization, took him in. They helped him appeal for his freedom. The Committee of Vigilance was an extraordinary organization. Founded by black and white abolitionists in New York, it existed specifically to help freedom seekers who arrived in the city. They provided legal assistance, temporary housing, protection from slave catchers, and connections to the broader abolitionist network. Without them, Muhammad's escape would likely have failed. But Captain da Costa wasn't about to let his property walk away. He fought back legally. There were hearings, arguments, legal maneuvering, and at some point during this process, Muhammad found himself in jail. The very system that was supposed to protect freedom was holding him captive again, and it looked like the next appeal would fail, like he'd be returned to the ship, to slavery, to Brazil. So he escaped. Again. With help from the Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave conductors, Muhammad fled from New York to Boston. It was a nation built by formerly enslaved people who had won their freedom through revolution. Slavery had been abolished there. It was safe. For about 2 years, Muhammad lived at the Free Baptist Mission in Port-au-Prince. And here's where his story takes another remarkable turn. The man who had been a Muslim scholar, who had completed the Hajj, who had studied the Quran, made a decision that must have been agonizing. He converted to Christianity. Now, we can't know exactly what was in his heart during this time. Was it genuine spiritual transformation? Was it practical necessity, knowing that Christian networks offered the best path forward for an escaped slave seeking education and support? Was it some combination of both? We don't have a clear answer, and maybe Muhammad himself struggled with that question. What we do know is that conversion wasn't a simple or easy process for him. This wasn't just changing religious labels, this was turning away from the faith of his family, the tradition he'd been raised in, the beliefs that had shaped his identity from childhood. He'd been a marabout. Islam wasn't just his religion, it was woven into his entire understanding of himself and the world. But perhaps the trauma of slavery had shaken his faith. Perhaps seeing the brutality that Christians inflicted on enslaved people and then seeing other Christians work tirelessly to free them made him reconsider what religion meant. Perhaps he found in Christian teachings about redemption and salvation something that spoke to his experience in ways Islam no longer could. Perhaps the promise of a God who suffered, who was crucified and rose again, resonated with someone who had died in one life and was being reborn in another. Or perhaps it was more practical. The Free Baptist Mission in Haiti offered him shelter, food, and safety. The abolitionist networks that could help him were predominantly Christian. Converting opened doors, created opportunities, provided support systems that might not have been available otherwise. And Muhammad was nothing if not strategic. He'd learned Portuguese while enslaved. He'd waited for the right moment to escape. He knew how to position himself for survival and advancement. Whatever his reasons, the conversion was real enough that he would later identify as a Christian publicly, work with Christian organizations, and express Christian beliefs in his writings. But the complexity of that decision, the layers of meaning and motivation, remained part of the mystery of who Muhammad truly was. He returned to New York, not to hide, not to simply survive, but to learn. To transform himself yet again, this time, into something the slave system never intended, an educated voice that could speak truth to power. And this is where we arrive at one of the most extraordinary institutions in American history, a place that most people have never heard of, but that represented everything the future could be. New York Central College in McGrawville, Cortland County. Founded by anti-slavery Baptists in the years before the Civil War, it was the first institution in the United States built on a principle that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary then. All qualified students were welcome, regardless of race or gender. Think about the context. This was the 1850s. The South was still operating under slavery. The North was segregated. Most colleges wouldn't admit black students at all. Those few that did often segregated them in separate classes or housing. Women's education was limited and separate, focused on domestic skills rather than academic subjects. But in this small town in upstate New York, in a region thick with abolitionist Baptists, there was a school where black students sat next to white students, where women studied alongside men, where the only requirement was the desire to learn. The college had been founded in 1849, just 2 years before Muhammad arrived. It was a bold experiment, and it attracted students who believed in that vision of equality. The student body was diverse in ways that wouldn't be seen again in American higher education for more than a century. Black and white students lived in the same dormitories, ate at the same tables, studied in the same classrooms. Women pursued the same rigorous academic curriculum as men. Muhammad walked into those classrooms already fluent in 4 languages: Arabic, Dendi, probably Hausa, and Portuguese. He'd taught himself Portuguese while enslaved. Now he set about mastering English, and then French. 6 languages total. 6 different ways of seeing the world, 6 different tools for expressing the truth of what he'd experienced. Can you imagine what that must have felt like, to sit in a classroom as a student, not as property, to hold a book without fear of punishment, to raise your hand and ask questions, to be called by your real name, Muhammad Gado Bakwakwa, not Jose da Costa or whatever other name had been forced on you, to engage in discussions with other students who saw you as an equal, who valued your perspective, who wanted to hear your thoughts. If this story of transformation through education inspires you, share it with someone who needs to hear that knowledge is power that no one can take away. Help others discover that literacy and learning can be tools of liberation. The curriculum at New York Central College was rigorous. Students studied classical languages like Latin and Greek. They learned mathematics, natural sciences, philosophy and theology. They read literature and history. They practiced public speaking and debate. For Muhammad, every class was an opportunity to sharpen his mind, to develop the skills he would need to tell his story effectively. The college environment itself was transformative. Imagine Muhammad sitting in a philosophy class, discussing ideas about human nature and natural rights with students who 2 years earlier wouldn't have been allowed in the same room with him in most of America. Imagine him in a literature class, reading works that explored themes of freedom and oppression, finding his own experience reflected in texts written by people who'd never been enslaved. Imagine him in a public speaking class, learning the rhetorical techniques that would help him become an effective advocate for abolition. He wasn't just learning for himself. He had a mission, a calling that had been forming since his days in the hold of that slave ship. He was going to tell the world what slavery really was. Not the sanitized version that apologists promoted, not the abstract debates that politicians had, but the lived reality, the stripped bodies, the boiled corn, the lash, the casual cruelty, the systematic destruction of human dignity. But he needed help. Writing a book in what was essentially his 5th language, navigating the publishing world, reaching an audience, all of this required collaboration. And he found his partner in Samuel Downing Moore, a Unitarian minister from Ireland who had made abolitionism his life's work. Moore was driven by deep religious conviction. He believed that slavery was a sin against God and humanity, and he was willing to put that belief into action. When he met Muhammad, probably through abolitionist networks in New York, he saw an opportunity to do something unprecedented, publish the testimony of someone who had been enslaved in Brazil, a story that had never been told before. They worked together through 1854. Muhammad spoke, Moore wrote and edited. It was a collaboration, a meeting of 2 men from vastly different backgrounds united by a common cause. Moore would have asked questions, prompted Muhammad to remember details, helped organize the narrative into a coherent structure. Muhammad would have shared his memories, corrected misunderstandings, insisted on accuracy in the details that mattered most. The process of creating the autobiography was itself a form of healing and reclamation. Every memory Muhammad shared, every detail he insisted on including, was an act of resistance against the erasure that slavery represented. The system had tried to make him disappear, to reduce him to a nameless body. Now he was claiming his story, his name, his identity in the most permanent way possible, in print. The result was a 66-page book with a long, descriptive title in the style of the time, Biography of Muhammad G. Bakwakwa, a native of Zugu in the interior of Africa, a convert to Christianity, with a description of that part of the world. Published in Detroit in 1854, it was explicitly designed with two purposes. First, to scrutinize the evils of slavery, to expose what was happening in Brazil, where the trade continued illegally. Second, to raise funds for Muhammad himself to support his continued education and his dream of returning to Africa as a missionary. The book was extraordinary. It documented things that no other source had captured. The perspective of someone who had been free, then enslaved, then free again. Someone who could compare the sophisticated Islamic culture of West Africa with the brutal plantation system of Brazil. Someone who could speak with authority about the Middle Passage because he'd survived it. Muhammad gave sworn testimony that was published in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, appearing alongside statements from Captain Costa himself and another enslaved person, José da Rocha. He wrote about being branded, about being chained together with other captives, about the slave markets where he remained but a day or two before being sold. He described landing a few miles from the city at a farmer's house, which was a slave market, where the farmer had a great many slaves and used the lash pretty freely. These weren't abstract descriptions. These were witnessed truths documented by someone who had been there, who had felt the chains, who had seen the violence. And because Muhammad was educated, because he could write, because he had the support of abolitionists like Moore, his testimony reached audiences that might never have heard it otherwise. He also contributed to other abolitionist publications. In Julia Griffiths's Autographs for Freedom, published the same year as his biography, Muhammad wrote about the need for a black industrial college. He understood something crucial. Freedom wasn't just about escaping slavery. It was about building institutions that could support free black people who were excluded from most educational opportunities. It was about creating pathways for others to follow. By 1854, Muhammad had moved to Canada, continuing his education, continuing his advocacy. His stated goal was clear. He wanted to return to Africa as a Christian missionary, to bring back the education he'd gained, to serve his people in a new capacity. He envisioned using his multiple languages, his understanding of both African and Western cultures, his education, to bridge worlds and help his community. And then, in 1857, he vanished from the historical record. No death certificate, no final letters, no documentation of where he went or what happened to him. After 1857, there's just silence. Historians who have studied his life have searched archives in the United States, Canada, Britain, and Africa. They've found nothing. Did he achieve his dream and return to Africa? It's possible. The journey would have been difficult, but not impossible. Perhaps he made it back to West Africa, maybe even to Jugu, and lived out his days there, his American adventures becoming a story he told to children and grandchildren. Perhaps he worked as a missionary or teacher, using his education to serve his community, and simply never appeared in written records that survived. Did he die young, his health broken by the trauma of slavery? That's also possible. The Middle Passage took a terrible toll on survivors. Many who escaped slavery died young from the physical and psychological damage they'd endured. Perhaps Muhammad fell ill and died quietly, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Canada or the northern United States. Did he choose to live quietly, anonymously, tired of being a public figure? Maybe he wanted to disappear from the historical record, to live a private life away from the scrutiny and the constant reminders of his trauma. Maybe he changed his name again, this time by choice, and started fresh somewhere new. We don't know. That disappearance haunts me, but maybe it's fitting, because Muhammad's story was never just about him. It was about all the voices that were silenced, all the stories that were never written down, all the people who crossed oceans in chains and whose names we'll never know. His disappearance reminds us of how much history has been lost, how many lives left no trace. But here's what makes his story different. Here's why it matters. Muhammad didn't just survive. He didn't just escape. He transformed himself into exactly what the slave system feared most: an educated, articulate witness who could speak in the language of power and expose the truth. Remember that question I asked at the beginning? How does someone who loses everything not only survive, but become one of the most educated voices against slavery? Here's the answer, and it's not what you might expect. It wasn't just resilience, though Muhammad had that in abundance. It wasn't just intelligence, though he was clearly brilliant. It wasn't just luck, though he benefited from the help of abolitionists at crucial moments. The answer is something deeper, something that reveals a truth about human transformation that applies far beyond the 19th century. Muhammad succeeded because he understood that knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken from him. They could chain his body, they could sell him like property, they could force him to work, they could even change his name, but they couldn't stop him from learning Portuguese while enslaved. They couldn't prevent him from remembering his Arabic literacy. They couldn't erase his understanding of multiple cultures and languages. Every language he learned was an act of resistance. Every fact he remembered was a weapon against the lie that enslaved people were less than human. Every word he wrote was proof that the system was built on a foundation of deliberate ignorance and enforced illiteracy. And when he finally had the chance, when he reached New York and then that integrated college in McGrawville, he weaponized that knowledge. He turned his education into testimony. He transformed his suffering into a historical record that would outlast him. He made sure that even if his own fate remained unknown, his voice would echo forward through time. That's the real answer. Transformation isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about using whatever tools you have, even if those tools are just your mind and your memory, to prepare for the moment when opportunity arrives. Muhammad was ready when he heard about New York. He was ready when he met the abolitionists. He was ready when he sat down with Samuel Moore to write his story. He was ready because he'd never stopped learning, never stopped observing, never stopped believing that knowledge mattered. His autobiography remains the only first-hand account of Brazilian slavery from someone who lived it. Think about how easily that voice could have been lost. If he'd died in the Middle Passage, if he'd failed to escape in New York, if he'd been returned to Captain da Costa, if he'd never learned to write in English, if he'd never met Samuel Moore, we would have no record of what slavery in Brazil was really like from the perspective of the enslaved. But he survived. He escaped, he learned, he wrote, and because of that, we have his testimony. We have his description of the Middle Passage, of the slave markets, of the daily violence. We have his perspective as someone who had been free, who knew what he'd lost, who could articulate the difference between the cosmopolitan world of Jugu and the dehumanizing system of Brazilian slavery. That's power. That's the power of education, of literacy, of refusing to let your story be told only by others. Muhammad took control of his own narrative in an era when that was almost impossible for someone who had been enslaved. So here's what I want you to take from Muhammad's story. Whatever challenges you're facing, whatever systems seem designed to keep you down, whatever limitations have been placed on you, remember this: knowledge is power that no one can take away. Every skill you learn, every book you read, every language you master, every piece of understanding you gain becomes part of you in ways that can't be stolen or sold. Muhammad learned Portuguese while enslaved because he knew that understanding the language of power would serve him someday. He was right. That knowledge helped him escape, helped him navigate freedom, helped him tell his story. He didn't wait for perfect conditions to start learning. He used whatever opportunities he had, even in the worst circumstances. And when opportunity came, when that ship docked in New York, he was ready. He'd been preparing, even if he didn't know exactly what he was preparing for. That's the lesson. Prepare yourself, learn, grow, develop your skills and knowledge. Because you never know when the moment will come that requires everything you've built. What limitations in your own life might actually be opportunities for transformation? What knowledge could you be gaining right now that will serve you later? What story do you need to tell? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation about transformation, resilience, and the power of reclaiming your voice. Mahoma Gado Bakwakwa crossed 3 continents, mastered 6 languages, and transformed himself from enslaved laborer to educated abolitionist author. His journey reminds us that no matter where we start, no matter what obstacles we face, transformation is possible. The question isn't whether you can change your circumstances. The question is, are you preparing yourself for the moment when opportunity arrives? Are you ready to jump when your ship docks in New York?